In the middle of the busy city police station, Melanie Carter stands face to face with Officer Rodriguez, her 8-month pregnant belly straining against a thin gray shirt. Around them, the chaos of daily police work continues, phones ringing, officers typing reports, suspects being processed, but something about this woman's presence commands attention. Tears stream down her face as she trembles, not from the cold, but from 20 years of buried guilt finally surfacing. The officer notices her distressed state, stepping closer with concern. Her hands shake as 20 years of silence weigh heavy on her shoulders. The weight of her secret has become unbearable, and with a baby on the way, she can no longer live with the lie that destroyed her family. When she finally finds her voice, 5 words tumble out that will change everything. It's not him, it's me. But what crime has haunted her, and why did she sacrifice her brother? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 hours earlier, Melanie Carter had been arranging baby clothes in the nursery of her suburban home. Each tiny outfit folded with the precision of someone who believed in order, in control, in the possibility that some things could be perfect. The morning sun streamed through pale yellow curtains, gender neutral. She'd told the saleswoman, though she secretly hoped for a girl. A daughter she could raise differently, honestly, without the shadows that had shaped her own life. The house on Maple Street represented everything she'd worked toward for 20 years. 2 stories of white vinyl siding, a front porch with hanging ferns, a garden where she grew tomatoes and herbs with the dedication of someone who needed to believe in growth, in second chances. David had painted the nursery last weekend, his steady hands creating perfect edges where wall met ceiling. The kind of craftsmanship that came from a man who fixed things for a living and believed. Most problems had solutions. Marcus Carter's LATEST letter lay hidden beneath a stack of maternity books on her nightstand, unopened for 3 weeks now. She knew what it would contain, the same careful optimism he'd maintained for 20 years. Updates about the prison library where he worked, maybe a mention of another failed appeal. Never accusations, never bitterness toward the sister who visited twice a year and called once a month, always finding reasons why she couldn't come more often. The letters had arrived faithfully for 2 decades, written in Marcus's careful script on yellow legal paper. Early ones had been full of hope appeals in progress, new evidence being reviewed, lawyers who thought they had a chance. Later letters grew shorter, resigned, focused on small victories. A book that moved him, progress toward his associates. Degree, friendships with other long-term inmates who'd accepted their fate. Melanie kept them in a shoebox in her closet, beneath winter sweaters she rarely wore. Sometimes she'd read through them chronologically, watching her brother's handwriting change from the urgent scrawl of a young man fighting for his freedom to the measured script of someone who'd made peace with walls and schedules and the particular way hope died slowly over years. David thought she kept them out of family loyalty, the way some people maintained relationships with difficult relatives. He'd never read one, never asked about Marcus's crime beyond the basic facts she'd shared during their early dating years. Armed robbery, a store clerk badly hurt, a family shame she rarely discussed. David was good that way, respectful of boundaries, understanding that some wounds were better left undisturbed. Their marriage worked because it was built on the parts of herself she'd chosen to share. The dedicated school counselor who helped troubled teenagers, the woman who volunteered at the animal shelter, who made elaborate birthday dinners and remembered anniversaries. She'd become expert at constructing a life from the pieces of herself that weren't tangled up in that. October night in 1984. The pregnancy had been a surprise, coming after 3 years of trying and 2 miscarriages that had tested every foundation of their relationship. At 39, she'd begun to accept that motherhood might not be part of her story. Then the double lines appeared on the test, and everything shifted. This baby felt like redemption, a chance to create the kind of family she'd lost when Marcus went to prison. But lately, the weight of her secret had grown heavier with each week of pregnancy. Every prenatal appointment, every conversation about the future, every moment spent imagining her daughter's life felt shadowed by the truth she'd never spoken. How could she raise a child to value honesty when her own life was built on the most fundamental lie possible? The nightmare always started the same way. She was 17 again, standing in the fluorescent brightness of Mike's convenience store on the corner of 3rd and Elm. The bell above the door chimed as she entered. Same as it had thousands of times when she'd come in for milk or cigarettes for her mother. But this time was different. This time, desperation had followed her inside. The store clerk, Mr. Rodriguez, looked up from his newspaper with the weary smile he reserved for the neighborhood kids. Late 50s, thick glasses, the kind of man who knew every customer's name, and asked about their families. He'd given her free candy when she was 8, had let her and Marcus hang out by the comic book rack when Eleanor was too drunk to be around. "Melanie, Mia, you look tired. Everything okay at home?" She could still hear his voice, the gentle concern that made what happened next feel like the worst kind of betrayal. Her hand had been shaking as she'd reached into her jacket pocket, not for the gun that everyone later assumed, but for the letters, the eviction notice, the shut-off warnings, the collection agency threats that would destroy what remained of their family. The memory always fractured at that point, dissolving into fragments that made less sense with each passing year. Her mother's voice on the phone that morning. "They're going to take the house, Melanie. We'll be on the street by Christmas." The job she'd lost the week before when the diner closed. 2 months of unpaid bills piling up like accusations. Marcus, working double shifts at the warehouse, trying to hold everything together at 19, while their father sent empty promises and no money from wherever he'd landed this time. What happened next in the store remained locked behind a door in her mind that she'd stopped trying to open years ago. She remembered the aftermath more clearly, Marcus arriving to find chaos. Mr. Rodriguez on the floor, blood spreading beneath his head, her standing frozen by the register with her hands full of 20s and 10s. "Jesus Christ, Mel, what did?" "You do?" But Marcus hadn't waited for an answer. He'd taken the money from her shaking hands, helped her clean the blood from her fingers, made the decision that would define both their lives in the space between one breath and the next. "You were never here. You understand me? You were at home with Mom, watching TV. That's the truth now." The police had found Marcus 20 minutes later, still in the store, calling for an ambulance that had already been summoned by a neighbor who'd heard the commotion. His fingerprints on the register. His DNA under Mr. Rodriguez's fingernails from when he tried to help the injured man. His presence at the scene of a crime he'd had nothing to do with except trying to protect his little sister. Eleanor had arrived at the police station like a force of nature, demanding lawyers they couldn't afford, making calls to relatives who might help with bail. But the case was solid young man from a troubled family, history of minor infractions, caught at the scene of a violent robbery. When the public defender suggested a plea deal that would keep Marcus in prison for 20 years instead of life, Eleanor had taken it. 20 years is better than never, she'd told Melanie that night, sitting on the edge of her bed in the house they'd managed to keep with the insurance settlement from Mr. Rodriguez's family. "And you're never going to say a word about what really happened. Not to anyone. Not ever. Your brother made his choice to protect you, and you're going to honor that by keeping your mouth shut and building a life worth protecting." Melanie had kept that promise for 20 years, through high school graduation that Marcus missed, through college that his sacrifice had made possible, through job interviews where she'd learned to speak about her family in careful half-truths. She'd built a career helping troubled teenagers find alternatives to the choices that had destroyed her brother's life, always wondering if any of them could see the hypocrisy in her guidance. David knew about Marcus, but only the sanitized version, the brother who'd made bad choices, who was serving time, who remained part of her life despite the distance. He'd offered to drive her to prison visits, had sent Christmas cards Marcus's way, had accepted her family's complicated situation with the grace of a man who'd grown up in a stable home and couldn't quite imagine the desperation that led to violence. Their marriage had survived because David loved the woman she'd become, not the girl she'd been. He saw her dedication to her students, her fierce loyalty to friends, her capacity for forgiveness that extended to everyone except herself. He didn't know that her understanding of troubled teenagers came from being one herself, that her ability to counsel kids through bad decisions was born from living with the consequences of her own. Now, 8 months pregnant and facing the prospect of raising a daughter, the weight of that deception had become unbearable. Every kick from the baby felt like a question. What kind of mother builds her child's life on a foundation of lies? What kind of woman lets her brother serve 20 years for a crime he didn't commit? The baby shifted inside her as she stood in the nursery, tiny fists drumming against her ribs with an urgency that felt like a demand for truth. Soon, this child would look at her with absolute trust, would believe everything she said about right and wrong, about family and loyalty, about the kind of person she should grow up to be. How could she teach her daughter about honesty while living with the biggest lie of all? Marcus's letters had grown shorter over the years, but his forgiveness had remained constant. He never blamed her for the choice he'd made, never suggested that she should have spoken up. His acceptance of his fate had become another burden, proof that good people sometimes made sacrifices that bad people weren't brave enough to make themselves. The morning sun had shifted, casting longer shadows across the nursery floor. Soon, David would be home from his construction job, eager to discuss paint colors and crib placement, to plan for the future with the optimism of a man who believed in happy endings. They'd have dinner together, maybe look through baby name books, continue building the life that felt more fragile with each passing day. But first, she had a decision to make. The one she'd been avoiding for 20 years. The one that would either destroy everything she'd built or finally set her free. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had delivered hundreds of babies during her 15 years as an obstetrician, but she still smiled when sharing good news with expectant parents. Melanie lay on the examination table, gel cool against her swollen belly, watching the grainy black and white images flicker across the monitor like some cryptic message from the future. "Everything looks perfect," Dr. Mitchell said, moving the ultrasound wand with practiced precision. "Baby's measuring right on schedule, heart rate is strong, and—" She paused, adjusting the angle slightly. "Would you like to know the sex?" Melanie's breath caught. She and David had debated this moment for weeks, torn between wanting to know everything and preserving some mystery. But suddenly, looking at the tiny profile on the screen, the question answered itself. "It's a girl," Dr. Mitchell announced, her voice warm with the satisfaction of sharing joy. "A healthy baby girl." The words hit Melanie like a physical blow. A daughter. She was going to have a daughter. The image on the screen seemed to sharpen, and for a moment, she could almost see features: the curve of a cheek, the suggestion of tiny fingers. This wasn't just a baby anymore. This was a little girl who would grow up to ask questions, to want stories about her family, to look at her mother with the kind of trust that could either nurture or destroy. "That's wonderful," Melanie managed, though her voice sounded strange. To her own ears, a girl. Dr. Mitchell was still talking, pointing out details on the screen, discussing delivery dates and birthing classes, but Melanie heard only fragments. Her mind had traveled backward 20 years, to another teenage girl who'd made a choice that rippled through decades. "Family traditions are so special," Dr. Mitchell was saying as she cleaned the gel from Melanie's belly. "I bet your mother is excited about having a granddaughter to spoil." There's something magical about the bond between grandmothers and granddaughters. All those secrets and stories passed down through generations. Melanie sat up slowly, her hands trembling as she pulled her shirt down. Secrets and stories. What secrets would she pass down to her daughter? What stories could she tell that weren't built on lies? The drive home from the doctor's office passed in a blur. At every red light, Melanie found herself staring at other families, mothers pushing strollers, fathers holding small hands, children laughing in backyards behind chain-link fences. Normal families with normal histories were the worst secrets. Might be surprise parties or birthday presents hidden in closets. She parked in her driveway but couldn't bring herself to go inside. The house that had felt like a sanctuary that morning now seemed like a museum of lies, each room containing artifacts of the life she'd built on her brother's sacrifice. The family photos that didn't include Marcus. The conversations with neighbors where she'd never mentioned having a brother. The careful editing of her history that had become second nature. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. How did the appointment go? Everything okay? She stared at the message for a long time before typing back. Maybe he's healthy. It's a girl. His response came immediately. A girl. I'm so excited. Can't wait to celebrate tonight. Love you. Love you. The words that should have brought comfort instead felt like accusations. How could he love someone he didn't really know? How could anyone love the version of herself she'd constructed from selective truths and careful omissions? The memory came without warning, as it sometimes did during moments of stress. October 15th, 1984. The night that divided her life into before and after. The night that turned her from Melanie Carter into someone who just looked like her. She'd been 17, desperate, and furious at a world that seemed determined to destroy what little stability her family had managed to create. The eviction notice had arrived that morning, along with a final shut-off warning from the electric company and a letter from Marcus's school about unpaid fees that might prevent his graduation. Eleanor had been drinking again, the kind of steady, methodical drinking that turned her into a stranger who looked like their mother, but spoke in sharp edges and broken promises. Figure it out, Melanie, she'd said when Melanie showed her the stack of bills. You're smart. Figure out how to fix this. But there was nothing to fix. Marcus was already working 2 jobs. Eleanor couldn't hold steady employment, and their father had disappeared 6 months earlier with vague promises to send money that never came. 17-year-old Melanie had felt the weight of her family's survival settle on her shoulders. Like a coat made of stones, the plan hadn't been complicated. Mike's convenience store stayed open until 11, and Mr. Rodriguez often worked alone during the dinner rush. He knew her, trusted her, had never installed security cameras because he believed in treating his neighbors like family. She thought she could take just enough to catch up on the rent, maybe buy some time to find a real solution. But plans made by desperate teenagers rarely survived contact with reality. Mr. Rodriguez had recognized her immediately, had asked about Eleanor and Marcus with the genuine concern of someone who'd watched her grow up. When she'd finally worked up the courage to make her demand, I need you to open the register, he'd looked at her with such confusion and disappointment that she'd nearly walked away. Mia, what's this about? Is someone making you do this? She'd shown him the eviction notice with shaking hands, tried to explain about the bills and the threats and the fear that had been keeping her awake for weeks. He'd listened with the patience of a grandfather, had reached for his wallet to offer what help he could. I can lend you $50, he'd said, and maybe we can figure out something else. There are programs, assistance, but $50 wasn't enough, and pride was a luxury her family couldn't afford. When she'd insisted he open the register, when she'd reached across the counter with desperate hands, he tried to stop her. Not violently, not with any intention to hurt her, but with the firm grip of an adult trying to prevent a child from making a terrible mistake. The struggle had lasted only seconds. She'd pulled back reflexively. He'd lost his balance, and the sound of his head hitting the corner of the counter would haunt her dreams for the next 20 years. The blood had come immediately, spreading across the floor while Mr. Rodriguez lay unconscious, and she stood, frozen with a handful of bills that suddenly felt like the weight of the world. Marcus had found her there 20 minutes later, called by some instinct that something was wrong. He'd taken one look at the scene and understood exactly what had happened. Had seen his little sister's desperation written in Mr. Rodriguez's blood and her shaking hands. "Go home," he'd said simply. "Tell Mom I'll be late." She'd obeyed without question, had walked the 6 blocks to their house while Marcus called for an ambulance and waited for the police. By the time she'd reached their front door, she'd almost convinced herself that none of it had happened, that Mr. Rodriguez was fine, that Marcus would be home for dinner with some reasonable explanation for his absence. But the police cars had arrived an hour later, and Eleanor had left to post bail with money borrowed from her sister, and Marcus had come home the next morning with the hollow eyes of someone who'd seen his future disappear in a single night. "You don't say anything," Eleanor had told her that next morning, gripping her shoulders with fingers that left bruises. "Not to the police, not to lawyers, not to anyone. Marcus made his choice, and now you make yours. You keep quiet, and you build a life worth the sacrifice he made." Sitting in her driveway 20 years later, pregnant with a daughter who would inherit the consequences of that choice, Melanie finally understood what her mother had meant. The life she built, the marriage, the career, the respect of her community, all of it existed because Marcus had taken her place in a prison cell. But what kind of legacy was that for a little girl? What kind of inheritance was a family history? Built on lies and sacrifice and silence? Her daughter deserved better. She deserved a mother who could look her in the eye and tell her the truth about right and wrong, about consequences and courage, about the difference between protecting someone and enabling them. The decision crystallized in that moment, sitting in her car with the ultrasound photo in her hand and 20 years of guilt pressing against her chest like a weight that had finally become too heavy to carry. She was going to tell the truth. All of it, no matter what it cost. The baby kicked against her ribs as if in agreement, and for the first time in 20 years, Melanie Carter felt something that might have been peace. The law office of Peterson and Associates occupied the second floor of a building that had seen better decades, its waiting room furnished with chairs that might have been modern in the 1980s. Melanie sat with her hands folded over her belly, studying the water stains on the ceiling tiles while she waited for Harold Peterson to finish his phone call. She'd found his name in Marcus's old letters, mentioned briefly as the public defender who'd handled the original case. Now semi-retired and taking only a few clients, Peterson had agreed to see her on short notice, though his secretary had warned that his memory wasn't what it used to be. "Mrs. Hardwell, I'm sorry to keep you waiting." Peterson emerged from his office looking older than his 72 years, his handshake soft and his eyes slightly clouded. "You said on the phone this was about Marcus Carter? That's a name I haven't heard in a long time." His office was cluttered with case files and legal texts, the desk buried under papers that suggested a man who'd never quite mastered organization. Peterson settled into his chair with the careful movements of someone whose body had begun to betray him. "I represented Marcus 20 years ago," he said, pulling a thin file from a cabinet. "Robbery, assault. He took a plea deal. Good kid. Terrible situation. Why are you asking about him now?" Melanie had rehearsed this conversation during the drive over, but sitting across from the man who'd failed to save her brother, the words felt inadequate. "I'm his sister. I've been wondering about appeals, about whether there might be new options." Peterson's expression softened. "I remember you now. You were just a kid then, maybe 17. Your mother was so protective of you. Barely let you speak during family meetings. Do you remember much about the case? The evidence?" "Some of it," Peterson opened the file, scanning pages that looked thin and incomplete. Marcus was found at the scene. Fingerprints on the register, DNA evidence. The victim, Mr. Rodriguez, never regained consciousness long enough to give a statement. Died 6 months later from complications. He looked up. Why the sudden interest? Has something changed? Melanie's heart raced. Mr. Rodriguez died? You didn't know? I'm sorry. I thought your family would have been informed. He never recovered from the head injury, had complications from the surgery. Passed away in early 1985. Peterson closed the file gently. I'm afraid that makes things more complicated legally. What started as assault became something much more serious. The room seemed to tilt around her. Mr. Rodriguez was dead. Had been dead for 19 years, and she'd never known. Her desperate attempt to help her family had killed a kind man who'd offered to help her. The weight of that knowledge settled over her like a shroud. Double quotes, Mrs. Hartwell. Are you all right? She forced herself to focus on Peterson's concerned face. I'm fine. Just, it's a shock. What about statute of limitations? If new evidence came to light? Murder has no statute of limitations in this state. But what new evidence could there be after 20 years? Peterson leaned forward, his lawyer's instincts overriding his age. Is there something you want to tell me about your brother's case? Before she could answer, her phone rang. David's number. She declined the call, but the interruption broke whatever spell had been building in the dusty office. I should go, she said, struggling to her feet. Thank you for your time. Mrs. Hartwell, if there's something you know about that night, something that wasn't said during the trial. But she was already moving toward the door, the weight of Mr. Rodriguez's death crushing any words she might have found. The drive. Home blurred past strip malls and traffic lights that all looked the same. Mr. Rodriguez was dead. Had been dead for most of her adult life while she built her career and her marriage, and her comfortable suburban existence on the foundation of his murder. Because that's what it was now, wasn't it? Not robbery, not assault murder. She'd killed a man, and her brother was serving a life sentence for her crime. She pulled into her driveway and sat in the car, staring at the house that no longer felt like home. The yellow curtains in the nursery window looked cheerful in the afternoon sunlight, mocking her with their optimism. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. Missed your call. Everything okay? Can't wait to hear about the doctor visit tonight. She'd promised to cook his favorite dinner to celebrate the news about their daughter. How could she sit across from him and discuss baby names while carrying the weight of murder? The front door opened and Mrs. Chun from next door waved from her garden, where she was deadheading roses with the methodical precision of someone who believed in order and renewal. How are you feeling, dear? You look tired. Just pregnancy, Melanie called back, forcing a smile. Everything's fine. But nothing was fine. Everything was broken, had been broken for 20 years, and she was only now seeing the extent of the damage. Inside the house, she went straight to the closet where Marcus's letters waited in their shoebox. She pulled out the most recent one, dated 3 weeks ago, and read it with new eyes. Mel, hope you're doing well with the pregnancy. I've been thinking about names lately. If it's a girl, maybe something that means hope or new beginnings. I know that sounds sentimental, but 20 years in here gives you time to think about what matters. I've made peace with my situation, but knowing that you're building something good in the world makes it easier. Give my best to David. Love. Marcus made peace with his situation. 20 years for a crime he didn't commit, for protecting a sister who'd let him take the blame for murder. How did someone make peace with that level of injustice? She reached for her phone and dialed the prison. The automated system walked her through the options: visiting hours, commissary information, inmate communication. She'd made this call dozens of times over the years, always finding excuses not to follow through. This time, she pressed the number for visiting appointments. This is Officer Williams. How can I help you? I'd like to schedule a visit with an inmate. Marcus Carter, ID number 47,851. Relationship to inmate? Sister. Next available visit is Saturday at 2 p.m. Will that work? Saturday. 3 days away. 3 days to find the courage to look her brother in the eye and tell him that his sacrifice had been for a murderer. Yes, she said. That works. After she hung up, she sat in the silence of her bedroom, surrounded by the artifacts of the life Marcus's sacrifice had made possible. The diploma on the wall, earned with money his imprisonment had helped preserve. The wedding photos from a ceremony he couldn't attend. The baby clothes for a niece he might never get to hold if she told the truth, but he deserved the truth. Mr. Rodriguez's family deserved the truth, and her daughter deserved a mother who could look her in the eye without flinching. Saturday couldn't come fast enough. The law office of Peterson and Associates occupied the second floor of a building that had seen better decades. Its waiting room furnished with chairs that might have been modern in the 1980s. Melanie sat with her hands folded over her belly, studying the water stains on the ceiling tiles while she waited for Harold Peterson to finish his phone call. She'd found his name in Marcus's old letters, mentioned briefly as the public defender who'd handled the original case. Now semi-retired and taking only a few clients, Peterson had agreed to see her on short notice, though his secretary had warned that his memory wasn't what it used to be. Mrs. Hartwell, I'm sorry to keep you waiting. Peterson emerged from his office looking older than his 72 years, his handshake soft and his eyes slightly clouded. You said on the phone this was about Marcus Carter? That's a name I haven't heard in a long time. His office was cluttered with case files and legal texts, the desk buried under papers that suggested a man who'd never quite mastered organization. Peterson settled into his chair with the careful movements of someone whose body had begun to betray him. I represented Marcus 20 years ago, he said, pulling a thin file from a cabinet. Robbery, assault. He took a plea deal. Good kid, terrible situation. Why are you asking about him now? Melanie had rehearsed this conversation during the drive over, but sitting across from the man who'd failed to save her brother, the words felt inadequate. I'm his sister. I've been wondering about appeals, about whether there might be new options. Peterson's expression softened. I remember you now. You were just a kid then, maybe 17? Your mother was so protective of you, barely let you speak during family meetings. Do you remember much about the case? The evidence? Some of it. Peterson opened the file, scanning pages that looked thin and incomplete. Marcus was found at the scene. Fingerprints on the register, DNA evidence. The victim, Mr. Rodriguez, never regained consciousness long enough to give a statement. Died 6 months later from complications. He looked up. Why the sudden interest? Has something changed? Melanie's heart raced. Mr. Rodriguez died? You didn't know? I'm sorry. I thought your family would have been informed. He never recovered from the head injury, had complications from the surgery. Passed away in early 1985. Peterson closed the file gently. I'm afraid that makes things more complicated legally. What started as assault became something much more serious. The room seemed to tilt around her. Mr. Rodriguez was dead. Had been dead for 19 years, and she'd never known. Her desperate attempt to help her family had killed a kind man who'd offered to help her. The weight of that knowledge settled over her like a shroud. Double quotes. Mrs. Hartwell, are you all right? She forced herself to focus on Peterson's concerned face. I'm fine. Just, it's a shock. What about statute of limitations? If new evidence came to light? Murder has no statute of limitations in this state. But what new evidence could there be after 20 years? Peterson leaned forward, his lawyer's instincts overriding his age. Is there something you want to tell me about your brother's case? Before she could answer, her phone rang. David's number. She declined the call, but the interruption broke whatever spell had been building in the dusty office. "I should go," she said, struggling to her feet. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Hartwell. If there's something you know about that night, something that wasn't said during the trial," but she was already moving toward the door, the weight of Mr. Rodriguez's death crushing any words she might have found. The drive home blurred past strip malls and traffic lights that all looked the same. Mr. Rodriguez was dead, had been dead for most of her adult life while she built her career and her marriage, and her comfortable suburban existence on the foundation of his murder, because that's what it was now, wasn't it? Not robbery, not assault murder. She'd killed a man, and her brother was serving a life sentence for her crime. She pulled into her driveway and sat in the car, staring at the house that no longer felt like home. The yellow curtains in the nursery window looked cheerful in the afternoon sunlight, mocking her with their optimism. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. "Missed your call. Everything okay? Can't wait to hear about the doctor visit tonight." Tonight. She'd promised to cook his favorite dinner, to celebrate the news about their daughter. How could she sit across from him and discuss baby names while carrying the weight? Oh, murder. The front door opened, and Mrs. Chun from next door waved from her garden, where she was deadheading roses with the methodical precision of someone who believed in order and renewal. "How are you feeling, dear? You look tired." "Just pregnancy," Melanie called back, forcing a smile. "Everything's fine." But nothing was fine. Everything was broken, had been broken for 20 years, and she was only now seeing the extent of the damage. Inside the house, she went straight to the closet where Marcus's letters waited in their shoebox. She pulled out the most recent one, dated 3 weeks ago, and read it with new eyes. "Mal, hope you're doing well with the pregnancy. I've been thinking about names lately. If it's a girl, maybe something that means hope or new beginnings. I know that sounds sentimental, but 20 years in here gives you time to think about what matters. I've made peace with my situation, but knowing that you're building something good in the world makes it easier. Give my best to David. Love." Marcus made peace with his situation. 20 years for a crime he didn't commit, for protecting a sister who'd let him take the blame for murder. How did someone make peace with that level of injustice? She reached for her phone and dialed the prison. The automated system walked her through the options: visiting hours, commissary information, inmate communication. She'd made this call dozens of times over the years, always finding excuses not to follow through. This time, she pressed the number for visiting appointments. "This is Officer Williams. How can I help you?" "I'd like to schedule a visit with an inmate. Marcus Carter, ID number 47,851. Relationship to inmate? Sister. Next available visit is Saturday at 2 p.m. Will that work? Saturday. 3 days away. 3 days to find the courage to look her brother in the eye and tell him that his sacrifice had been for a murderer. Yes, she said. That works. After she hung up, she sat in the silence of her bedroom, surrounded by the artifacts of the life Marcus's sacrifice had made possible. The diploma on the wall, earned with money his imprisonment had helped preserve. The wedding photos from a ceremony he couldn't attend. The baby clothes for a niece he might never get to hold if she told the truth. But he deserved the truth. Mr. Rodriguez's family deserved the truth. And her daughter deserved a mother who could look her in the eye without flinching. Saturday couldn't come fast enough. The corner of 3rd and Elm hadn't changed much in 20 years. The same cracked sidewalk, the same bus stop where teenagers still gathered after school, the same view of the railroad tracks that carried freight trains through the heart of the old neighborhood. But Mike's convenience store was gone, replaced by a check-cashing place with barred windows and a hand-painted sign advertising phone cards and money transfers. Melanie stood on the opposite corner, her hand resting on her belly while she studied. The building where her life had fractured. The yellow brick was the same, but everything else had been gutted and reconfigured. No trace remained of the store where Mr. Rodriguez had died because of her desperation. "Excuse me, are you all right?" The voice belonged to a woman about her mother's age, wearing scrubs and sensible shoes, obviously heading home from a hospital shift. Her face was kind but tired, marked by the particular exhaustion that came from caring for people in pain. "I'm fine," Melanie said automatically, then reconsidered. "Actually, I used to know this corner. There was a convenience store here. A long time ago. Mike's Place?" The woman's expression brightened with recognition. "I remember that store. My husband shopped there all the time." "Such a tragedy, what happened to poor Miguel." Miguel. Mr. Rodriguez had a first name, a life, a family who remembered him as more than just a victim in a case file. Melanie's throat tightened. "You knew him?" "Miguel Rodriguez was my neighbor for 15 years. Sweetest man you'd ever meet. He gave my kids free candy when I was struggling to make ends meet. Let people buy groceries on credit when times were hard. The whole neighborhood grieved when he passed." The woman, Mrs. Vasquez, she introduced herself, seemed eager to talk about Miguel, as if keeping his memory alive was a sacred duty. She told Melanie about his wife Maria, how she'd never recovered from losing him, about their 3 children who'd struggled after their father's death, about the life insurance that had barely covered the medical bills from his months in the hospital. "Maria still lives in the same house," Mrs. Vasquez said, pointing down Elm Street toward a row of small bungalows. "Blue house with the rose garden. She tends those roses like they're her children. Miguel planted them for their anniversary the year before he died." After Mrs. Vasquez continued on her way, Melanie walked slowly down Elm Street until she found the blue house. The roses were magnificent red and white, and yellow blooms that cascaded over a white picket fence with the abundance of plants that were deeply loved. An older woman knelt among them, deadheading spent flowers with careful precision. Maria Rodriguez looked up as Melanie approached, her face lined but still beautiful, her hands gentle on the thorny stems. "They're lovely," Melanie said, though. The words felt inadequate. "Miguel planted these for our 25th anniversary," Maria said, her voice carrying the slight accent that made Melanie remember Mr. Rodriguez's kindness all those years ago. "He said roses were like marriage beautiful, but you had to be careful with the thorns." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, 2 women separated by tragedy, but connected by loss. Maria resumed her gardening while Melanie watched, struggling with the weight of introduction. "How did you tell someone that you were responsible for their deepest grief?" "I knew your husband," Melanie said finally, "a long time ago. I used to shop at his store." Maria's face brightened. So many people remember Miguel fondly. He loved that store, loved serving the neighborhood. He used to say that strangers were just friends he hadn't met yet. The words hit Melanie like physical blows. Miguel Rodriguez had welcomed her into his store hundreds of times, had treated her like family, had been prepared to help her even when she threatened him, and she'd repaid that kindness by killing him. "The man who robbed the store," Melanie said carefully. "The one who went to prison. Do you ever think about him?" Maria's expression hardened slightly. "Marcus Carter. Yes, I think about him. Mostly. I wonder how someone so young could be so angry, so willing to hurt an innocent man for a few dollars." She pulled a weed with more force than necessary. "Miguel tried to help people, you know. He would have given that boy money if he'd just asked. But some people choose violence first." Melanie felt sick. Every word was a knife, every kindness. In Maria's voice, a reminder of what she'd destroyed. Marcus hadn't chosen violence, she had. Marcus hadn't been angry, she had. The wrong person was carrying the burden of Maria's hatred. "I should go," Melanie said, backing away from the fence. "Wait," Maria stood, brushing dirt from her knees. "You look upset. Are you sure you're all right?" The concern in her voice, the same tone Miguel might have used, nearly broke Melanie's composure entirely. "I'm pregnant," she said, as if that explained everything. "Hormones. Congratulations." Miguel would have been so happy to hear that. He loved children, loved thinking about the future they'd inherit. Maria smiled sadly. "I hope your baby grows up in a world with more kindness than the one that took my husband." The walk back to her car felt endless. Each step carried the weight of Maria's words, the image of her hands gentle on Miguel's roses, the love that had survived 20 years of grief. How could she add to that pain by revealing that Marcus, the man Maria blamed for her husband's death, was innocent? But how could she not? Her phone rang as she reached her car. David's number again. This time she answered. "Hey, where are you?" "I got home early and you're not here. I went for a drive. Had some errands." The lie came easily. 20 years of practice making deception feel natural. "The baby clothes look great in the nursery. I keep thinking about holding our little girl, teaching her to ride a bike, walking her down the aisle someday." His voice was full of the simple joy that had drawn her to him in the first place. "I can't believe how lucky we are." Lucky. The word felt like mockery. Their luck was built on Marcus's sacrifice, on Miguel's death, on Maria's grief. Nothing about their happiness was clean or earned. "I'll be home soon," she said. "Good. I picked up dinner from that Italian place you like. And I stopped by the bookstore, got a few more baby name books. I know we said we'd wait, but I keep thinking about names that start with H. Hope, Hannah, Haley." Hope. Marcus had suggested that name in his letter. Hope for a new beginning, hope for redemption, hope for a future that wasn't shadowed by the past. Maybe that was what this was about. Not just confession, but hope. Hope that telling the truth might somehow heal the wounds her silence had left festering for 20 years. "David," she said before he could hang up. "Yeah? I love you. Whatever happens, I need you to know that. I love you too. See you soon." After ending the call, she sat in her car outside Maria Rodriguez's house, watching the woman tend to her dead husband's roses with the devotion of someone who understood that love didn't end with death. Tomorrow she would visit Marcus and begin the process of setting him free. Tonight she would have dinner with her husband and pretend that their happiness wasn't borrowed time. But first, she needed to find the courage to forgive herself for 20 years of cowardice. The baby kicked against her ribs, and Melanie chose to interpret it as encouragement. Hope, after all, had to start somewhere. Eleanor Carter's house felt smaller every time Melanie visited, as if the walls were slowly closing in on memories too heavy for the cramped rooms to contain. The same brown carpet, worn thin in pathways between kitchen and living room, the same faded photographs on the mantel that stopped abruptly in 1984, as if the family had ceased to exist the night Marcus went to prison. "You're not looking well," Eleanor said by way of greeting, her eyes sharp despite her 72 years. She moved around the kitchen with the efficient motions of someone who'd learned to waste nothing, not time, not words, not emotional energy, on things that couldn't be changed. Melanie had come to help box up belongings for Eleanor's move to assisted living, but she found herself drawn to the corner bedroom that had been Marcus's. The walls still held thumbtack holes from posters of basketball players and rock bands, teenage dreams frozen in time. "Why did you keep his room like this?" Melanie asked, running her fingers along the dusty dresser where Marcus had kept his wallet and keys the night everything changed. "Because hope dies hard," Eleanor replied from the doorway. "Even when you know it's foolish." They worked in uncomfortable silence, filling boxes with clothes that would never be worn again, books that would never be read. In the closet, behind winter coats that smelled of mothballs and regret, Melanie found a shoebox that rattled when she lifted it. "What's this?" She opened it before Eleanor could object. Inside were letters, dozens of them, addressed to Marcus at the state prison, but these letters had never been sent. They were all sealed, all stamped, all dated from the first year of his incarceration. "Those are private," Eleanor said sharply, reaching for the box. But Melanie had already seen her own name on several envelopes, had recognized Eleanor's careful handwriting on letters that should have been sent 20 years ago. "You wrote to him. Why didn't you mail them?" Eleanor's composure cracked slightly. "Because some truths are too dangerous to put in writing." Melanie opened the top letter, dated December 1984, her mother's words written in the careful script of someone choosing each phrase with precision. "My dear Marcus, I know what you did for your sister. I know why you made that choice. But there are things you don't know, things I pray you never have to learn." The detective came by again today, asking questions about Melanie's whereabouts that night. "I told him she was home with me, watching television, but he keeps pushing. There's something about his tone that worries me. I've made some arrangements to ensure this investigation doesn't go any further, but the cost, God help me, the cost of protecting our family keeps getting higher." Melanie's hands shook as she read. "What arrangements? What cost?" Eleanor sat heavily on Marcus's bed, suddenly looking every one of her 72 years. Detective Morrison was ambitious, young, hungry, looking for a case that would make his career. He suspected there was more to the story, kept digging when he should have accepted the obvious answers. "What did you do?" "What any mother would do to protect her children." Eleanor's voice was flat, emotionless. "I used the only currency I had left." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications that Melanie didn't want to understand. But the truth was there in Eleanor's face, in the weight of 20 years of guilt that had bent her mother's shoulders and carved lines around her eyes. "The settlement money," Melanie said slowly, "from Miguel Rodriguez's family. You used it to bribe a police detective." "Not all of it. Just enough to make Morrison lose interest in pursuing alternative theories. Enough to make sure he focused on the evidence that pointed to Marcus and stopped looking for evidence that might point to you." The box of unsent letters felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. All these years, Melanie had believed that Marcus's conviction was the result of circumstance, of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. She'd never imagined that Eleanor had actively participated in ensuring his guilt. "You let them convict an innocent man, your own son. I saved an innocent girl. My daughter." Eleanor's voice hardened with the defensive anger of someone who'd made peace with impossible choices. Marcus was 19, legally an adult. The worst he would have faced was 20 years, maybe less with good behavior. But you were 17, a minor who could have been tried as an adult for murder. Do you know what happens to teenage girls in prison, Melanie? Do you have any idea what your life would have looked like? So you chose him over me. I chose to save the one I still could." Eleanor stood, moving to the window that looked out over the backyard where Marcus had played as a child. Marcus was already lost the moment he decided to protect you. But you still had a chance at a real life. Melanie sank into Marcus's desk chair, the weight of her mother's revelation crushing any illusions she'd maintained about moral complexity. This wasn't about family loyalty or impossible choices. This was about an active conspiracy to convict an innocent man. "The other letters," she said, gesturing to the box. "What did they say? Read them if you want. See how many times I wrote him the truth and then decided it was too dangerous to send." Eleanor's laugh was bitter. "I told myself I was protecting him from knowing how thoroughly his family had betrayed him." Melanie pulled out another letter. This one dated 6 months later. "Marcus, your appeal was denied today. I wanted to tell you not to lose hope, but what kind of hope can I offer when I know the system isn't interested in justice for you? I've created a prison for myself too, you know. Every night I lie awake thinking about the choice I made, wondering if there was another way. But then I see Melanie at graduation, or hear about her college acceptance, And I tell myself that saving one child was worth sacrificing the other. God forgive me, I still believe that. She's starting to show, Eleanor said quietly, nodding toward Melanie's belly. Your daughter, what will you tell her about her family? The truth. Which truth? That her mother is a murderer? That her grandmother is a criminal? That her uncle is serving time for a crime he didn't commit because the women in his family were too cowardly to let justice take its course. Each word was a knife, precisely aimed at the guilt Melanie had carried for 20 years. But underneath Eleanor's cruelty, she heard something else, fear. Fear that the careful structure of lies they built was finally collapsing. I'm going to tell Marcus, Melanie said, about everything. About what really happened that night. About what you did to ensure his conviction and destroy his last 20 years of peace. He's made his accommodation with prison life, Melanie. He's found purpose, found friends, found a way to survive. Why tear that down now? Because he deserves the truth. Because Miguel Rodriguez's family deserves justice. Because my daughter deserves better than a family built on lies. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, studying her daughter's face with the calculation of someone weighing options. Finally, she spoke. If you do this, if you confess, you'll go to prison. Maybe for the rest of your life. Your daughter will grow up without a mother. Maybe that's better than growing up with a mother who's a liar and a coward. And David? What about your husband? You'll destroy his life too. Tear apart the family you've built together. The questions hit their targets, each one designed to reinforce the walls of silence that had protected their family's secrets for 2 decades. But Melanie found that the guilt felt different now, not the crushing weight of unspoken truth, but the lighter burden of consequences finally accepted. I can't live with this anymore, she said simply. I won't raise my daughter in the shadow of what we've done. Eleanor nodded slowly, as if she'd been expecting this moment for 20 years. Then God help us all. The visiting room at Millfield Correctional Facility smelled of industrial disinfectant and broken drains. Melanie sat at a metal table, bolted to the floor, her hands folded over her belly while she waited for Marcus to emerge from the maze of security checkpoints that separated the free world from the confined one. When he finally appeared, she barely recognized the man her brother had become. 20 years had transformed the lanky 19-year-old into someone broader, more substantial, with the kind of careful composure that came from learning to navigate a world where showing weakness could be fatal. His hair was gray at the temples. Now, his face lined but not broken, his eyes holding a piece she'd never expected to see. Mo. He sat across from her with the measured movements of someone who'd learned to make no sudden gestures. You look good. Pregnancy suits you. You. Look. She struggled for words that weren't lies. You look well. Prison suits some people better than others. Turns out I'm good at routine, at keeping my head down and doing my work. His smile was genuine but careful. Tell me about the baby. David must be excited. They talked for 20 minutes about safe subjects, her pregnancy, David's construction business, the weather, anything that didn't touch the wounds that had brought her here. Marcus spoke about his job in the prison library, his work toward a bachelor's degree in social work, his plans for a future that existed only in theory. I've been thinking, he said eventually, about what I'd want to do if I ever got out. Help kids who are heading down the wrong path, maybe work with families in crisis. Funny how being locked up teaches you about freedom, about choices and consequences. The irony was crushing. Marcus had found purpose in prison, had turned his sacrifice into something meaningful, while she built her life on the foundation of his suffering. Marcus, she said finally, we need to talk about that night, about what really happened. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a wariness that suggested he'd been expecting this conversation for 20 years. What about it? You know, what about it? You know you didn't rob that store. You know you didn't hurt Ms. Gil Rodriguez. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, glancing around the visiting room where other inmates sat with their families, everyone, maintaining the careful pretense that normalcy was possible within these walls. Well, I've been in here for 20 years. I've learned not to think too hard about things I can't change. But you could change this if you told them the truth. The truth? Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The truth is that I found my 17-year-old sister standing over an injured man with blood on her hands and cash from his register scattered on the floor. The truth is that I made a choice to protect her, and I've never regretted it. The words hit her like physical blows. He'd known all along. 20 years of letters where he'd never once accused her, never once suggested that she should come forward, and he'd known the entire time. Why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you make me tell the truth? Because you were a kid who made a mistake, and I was an adult who could handle the consequences. Marcus's voice was calm, matter-of-fact. Because sending us both to prison wouldn't bring Miguel Rodriguez back or help his family heal. But your life, everything you could have been, I've been exactly who I needed to be. He gestured around the visiting room, encompassing the institutional walls and barred windows that had contained his existence for 2 decades. You think this is a waste, but you're wrong. I've helped more people in here than I ever could have on the outside. Kids who were heading toward violence, men who needed to learn how to read, families who needed someone to write letters they couldn't write themselves. That's not the point. It's exactly the point. Marcus's voice carried a firmness she remembered from their childhood when he'd stepped between her and neighborhood bullies or Eleanor's drunken rages. I've made peace with my choices, Mel. The question is whether you can make peace with yours. I can't. I'm going to tell them the truth. About that night? About Mom bribing Detective Morrison? About all of it. Marcus's composure cracked for the first time since she'd arrived. Mom did what? The conversation that followed was the hardest of Melanie's life. She told him about Eleanor's unsent letters, about the bribery that had ensured his conviction, about 20 years of active conspiracy to keep him imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit. With each revelation, she watched her brother's carefully constructed peace crumble. She let me think it was just bad luck, he said finally. Just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. I built my whole understanding of what happened around the idea that the system failed, not that my own family actively worked against me. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Marcus. Don't apologize to me. Apologize to yourself. Marcus stood, pacing to the window that looked out over the prison yard where other inmates walked in careful circles. You've been in a different kind of prison. For 20 years, one built out of guilt and secrets. At least my walls are visible. When I tell them the truth, you'll be free. You can have the life you should have had. I'm 51 years old, Mel. I don't know how to live in a world without walls and schedules and guards. Freedom isn't always a gift, especially when it comes with the knowledge that your family sacrificed your innocence to preserve their comfort. The visiting time was almost over. Soon, Marcus would return to his cell and his routine, while she drove home to David and their unborn daughter, and the choice that would determine all their futures. What do you want me to do? She asked. Marcus turned from the window, his face carrying the weight of 20 years of acceptance that was slowly transforming into something harder to bear. I want you to think about whether confession is about justice or guilt, whether you're trying to save me or save yourself. Both, maybe. Maybe that's honest enough. He returned to the table, reaching across to touch her hand, the first physical contact they'd shared in years. But understand this. Once you start telling the truth, you can't control where it leads. Mom will face criminal charges. Your marriage might not survive. You could go to prison while your daughter is still a baby. I know. And you're willing to accept those consequences? Melanie thought about David making dinner at home, about the nursery with its yellow curtains and carefully folded clothes, about Maria Rodriguez tending roses planted by a husband who died because of her desperation. She thought about her daughter growing up with questions about why mommy was in prison, about Elena facing charges for obstruction of justice, about Marcus learning to live in a world that had moved on without him. "I have to be," she said. "For her." Marcus nodded slowly. "Then I'll support whatever you decide. But Mel, when you tell the truth, tell all of it. Don't protect Mom. Don't protect me. Don't protect anyone. If you're going to tear down 20 years of lies, make sure you get them all." The guard announced that visiting time was over. As Marcus stood to leave, he paused at her shoulder. "What are you going to name her? The baby?" "Hope," Melanie said. "Her name is going to be Hope." Marcus smiled, the first completely genuine expression she'd seen from him all day. "That's perfect." Miguel Rodriguez would have liked that name. Detective Sarah Chun had been with the police department for 28 years, long enough to remember when case files were kept in manila folders instead of computer databases, when forensic science was more art than precision instrument. She'd seen technology transform criminal investigation from educated guesswork into something approaching certainty, had watched DNA evidence exonerate dozens of men and women who'd been convicted in the days when eyewitness testimony and circumstantial evidence were enough to destroy a life. The call came on a Tuesday morning while she was reviewing cold cases, part of a department initiative to apply new forensic techniques to unsolved crimes from the 1980s and 1990s. Marcus Carter's name appeared on a list of cases flagged for DNA retesting, not because anyone suspected wrongful conviction, but because advances in genetic analysis might reveal additional evidence about accomplices or motive. "Mrs. Hartwell, this is Detective Chun with the City Police. I'm calling about your brother's case, Marcus Carter. We'd like to retest some physical evidence using newer techniques." Melanie's voice was carefully controlled when she answered. "What kind of evidence?" "Blood samples, air fibers, fingerprint analysis. Technology has improved significantly since 1984. We might be able to develop a clearer picture of what happened that night." The conversation was brief, professional, routine. Detective Chun had made dozens of similar calls over the past month, most resulting in confirmation of existing convictions. She had no reason to expect Marcus Carter's case would be different. But when the lab results arrived 3 weeks later, they turned 20 years of accepted truth upside down. The blood evidence that had seemed straightforward in 1984 told a more complex story when subjected to modern analysis. Multiple DNA profiles and samples that had originally been attributed to a single source. Hair fibers that didn't match Marcus Carter or Miguel Rodriguez. Most significantly, a partial fingerprint on the cash register that had been dismissed as too degraded for comparison now yielded a clear match to someone in the criminal database, someone who wasn't Marcus Carter. Detective Chun spread the files across her desk, studying crime scene photographs with the fresh perspective that 20 years and new evidence provided. The original investigators had focused on the obvious narrative. Young man from troubled family commits desperate robbery. Violence ensues. But the forensic evidence suggested a different story, one that had been obscured by assumptions and incomplete. Analysis doubt. She picked up her phone and dialed the district attorney's office. "Janet, it's Sarah Chun. We have a problem with the Marcus Carter conviction. A big problem." The conversation that followed led to more phone calls, consultations with forensic experts, and a growing certainty that a significant miscarriage of justice had occurred. The evidence didn't just suggest Marcus Carter might be innocent. It proved that someone else had been in that store, someone whose identity had been overlooked for 20 years. But identifying that person would require more investigation, more resources, and potentially reopening wounds that had been healing for 2 decades. Detective Chun's next call was to Melanie Mrs. Hartwell. I need you to come to the station. We've discovered some irregularities in your brother's case that require discussion. The meeting took place in a conference room that smelled of coffee and institutional cleaning supplies. Detective Chun had arranged the evidence carefully: lab reports, photographs, forensic analyses that painted a picture radically different from the one that had sent Marcus to prison. This is difficult to explain without seeming to criticize my colleagues, Chun began, but I believe there were serious errors in the original investigation of your brother's case. Melanie sat very still, her hands folded over her belly as Chun walked through the evidence. The DNA that proved multiple people had been in the store. The fingerprints that belonged to someone with a criminal record who hadn't been investigated. The blood spatter analysis that suggested a struggle very different from what prosecutors had described at trial. What does this mean for Marcus? Melanie asked, though her voice suggested she already knew. It means he's going to be exonerated. The evidence clearly establishes that he didn't commit this crime. Chun paused, studying Melanie's face for reactions that might provide clues about what had really happened. But it also means we have to reopen the investigation into who actually robbed that store and killed Miguel Rodriguez. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. Chum had been a detective long enough to recognize the signs of someone carrying guilty knowledge, and everything about Melanie Hartwell's demeanor suggested she knew more than she'd ever admitted. Mrs. Hartwell, is there anything you want to tell me about that night? Anything that might help us understand what really happened? Melanie's carefully constructed composure began to crack. 20 years of silence. 20 years of watching Marcus pay for her crime. And now the truth was emerging, whether she chose to reveal it or not. The irony was almost unbearable. She'd finally found the courage to confess, only to discover that confession might no longer be necessary for Marcus's freedom. I need to think, she said finally. This is a lot to process. Of course. But Mrs. Hartwell, if you have information that could help us identify the real perpetrator, I hope you'll consider sharing it. Miguel Rodriguez's family deserves closure, and we need to ensure that the person responsible is held accountable. After leaving the police station, Melanie drove aimlessly through the city, her mind reeling with the implications of Chun's revelation. Marcus would be free regardless of whether she confessed. The forensic evidence would exonerate him, would restore his life and reputation without requiring her to destroy her own. She could remain silent, could let the investigation follow its scientific course, could allow Marcus to be released without anyone learning about her role in Miguel Rodriguez's death. Her daughter could grow up with a mother who wasn't in prison. David could continue believing in the woman he'd married. Eleanor could avoid criminal charges for her role in the cover-up. But what about justice for Miguel Rodriguez? What about his family's right to know the truth? The forensic evidence might prove Marcus's innocence, but it wouldn't necessarily lead investigators to her unless she provided that connection herself. She pulled into the parking lot of a church she'd attended as a child, sitting in her car while she watched people come and go from evening services. Normal people with normal problems. Families whose biggest secrets involved surprise parties and white lies about Santa Claus. Her phone rang. David. Hey, where are you? Dinner's getting cold. Sorry, I had an appointment that ran long. I'll be home soon. Everything okay? You sound strange. Everything was strange. Everything was impossible. 20 years of guilt might be unnecessary. 20 years of Marcus's sacrifice might be ending. And she still didn't know what the right choice looked like. David, she said, if you discovered that everything you thought you knew about me was wrong, would you still love me? That's a weird question. But yes, of course. Why? Just thinking about the baby, about what kind of people we want to be for her. We're going to be great parents. Mal, We're going to give her everything we didn't have: stability, honesty, love without conditions. Honesty. The word hit her like a slap. After hanging up, she sat in the church parking lot while darkness settled around her and made her decision. Not about confession. That choice had been made weeks ago in the ultrasound technician's office. But about the scope of that confession, about whether to reveal only her own guilt or to expose the full extent of her family's conspiracy. Detective Chun had been right about one thing. Miguel Rodriguez's family deserved closure. They deserved to know that their husband and father had died not because of random violence by a career criminal, but because of desperation by a teenage girl who'd been too proud to ask for help. They deserved to know that the man they'd spent 20 years hating was innocent. Marcus deserved to be exonerated not just by scientific evidence, but by the truth. Eleanor deserved to face consequences for her role in perpetuating injustice. And Hope deserved to inherit a family legacy based on courage rather than cowardice, on truth rather than convenience. The choice, when it finally crystallized, felt less like a decision than like an acknowledgement of what had always been inevitable. She was going to tell Detective Chen everything, not because the law required it, not because Marcus needed it for his freedom, but because 20 years of silence had been 20 years too long. She started her car and drove toward home, toward David and dinner and one last evening of the life she'd built on lies. Tomorrow she would begin the process of tearing it all down. The morning of her confession dawned gray and cold. October weather that reminded Melanie of another October 20 years earlier. She stood at her bedroom window, watching neighbors begin their ordinary days, walking dogs, retrieving newspapers, loading children into cars for school. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that the woman across the street was about to detonate 20 years of carefully constructed lies. David had left early for a job site, kissing her goodbye with the casual affection of a man who believed his wife would be there when he returned. She'd almost told him then, almost confessed everything while he stood in their doorway with his coffee and work boots. But the words had frozen in her throat. Instead, she'd said, "I love you," and watched him drive away, possibly for the last time as a free woman. The contractions had started around dawn, not labor pains. The doctor would later explain, but Braxton Hicks' contractions brought on by stress. Her body was preparing for something, even if it wasn't birth. The baby seemed restless too, kicking and shifting as if sensing her mother's agitation. At 9 o'clock, Eleanor called. "I've been thinking about our conversation," her mother said without preamble, "about what you're planning to do. And don't." Eleanor's voice carried 20 years of practice at commanding obedience. "Don't destroy everything we've built for some misguided notion of justice. Marcus will be free regardless. The forensic evidence will see to that. What about Miguel Rodriguez's family? What about the truth? The truth is a luxury we can't afford. Do you think Maria Rodriguez will feel better knowing that her husband died because of teenage desperation rather than criminal malice? Do you think it will comfort her to learn that she spent 20 years hating an innocent man?" The questions hit their marks, as Eleanor knew they would. Maria Rodriguez, tending Miguel's roses with such devotion, carrying 20 years of justified anger toward Marcus. Would the truth heal her grief or compound it? "I can't live with this anymore, Mom." You've lived with it for 20 years. You can live with it for 20 more. But Eleanor's certainty felt brittle now, desperate in a way that suggested she knew her power over her daughter was finally ending. After hanging up, Melanie sat in the nursery, surrounded by yellow clothes and stuffed animals and the promise of new life. At 10:30, Detective Chun called. "Mrs. Hartwell, we've made some progress on your brother's case. I wonder if you could come in this afternoon to answer a few questions." "What kind of questions?" "Nothing formal. We're just trying to understand the family dynamics from that time, period. See if there's anything that might help us identify who was actually responsible for Mr. Rodriguez's death." Melanie closed her eyes. The investigation was moving forward with or without her confession. Soon, Chun would start asking harder questions, would begin to piece together the inconsistencies in the original case. Better to control the narrative than let it unfold randomly. "I can come in now," Melanie said. "There are some things I need to tell you." The drive to the police station felt like a journey through memory. Every street corner held reminders of the girl she'd been 20 years ago, the high school, where she'd graduated with honors because Marcus's sacrifice had kept her out of prison, the community college where she'd earned her degree, the social services building where she'd found her calling helping troubled families. All of it built on a foundation of lies. At 11:15, she called David. "Hey, beautiful. How are you feeling?" "David, I need you to sit down. That doesn't sound good. What's wrong? Is it the baby?" "The baby's fine. But I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen without interrupting." The silence on the other end stretched long enough for her to wonder if he'd hung up. Finally, "Okay, I'm listening." She told him everything. About that night in 1984, about Marcus's sacrifice, about Eleanor's bribery, about 20 years of living with blood on her hands. She told him about Miguel Rodriguez's death, about the family she'd destroyed, about the man who'd spent 2 decades in prison for her crime. When she finished, the silence was deafening. "David, are you there?" "I'm here." His voice sounded hollow, distant. I need a minute to process this. I'm going to the police station now. I'm going to tell them everything." "Mal, wait. Let's talk about this. Maybe there's another way." "There is no other way. Not anymore." "What about us? What about our baby?" The question she'd been dreading, the one that made her choice feel like the worst kind of selfishness. "I don't know. I hope you can forgive me someday. I hope you can understand why I have to do this. Come home first, please. Let's figure this out together." But if she went home, if she saw David's face and felt his arms around her and heard him try to convince her that silence was still an option, she might lose her nerve. And she couldn't afford to lose her nerve. Not when she was this close to finally doing the right thing. "I love you," she said. "Remember that, whatever happens next." She hung up before he could respond. At noon, she called Marcus at the prison. "This is unexpected," he said when he came to the phone. 2 calls in 1 month. People will start to think we're close. I'm going to do it today. I'm going to tell them everything." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "Are you sure?" "No, but I'm going to do it anyway." "What changed your mind?" Detective Chung called. "They have forensic evidence that will clear you regardless of what I say. But Miguel's family deserves to know the truth, and you deserve to be exonerated by honesty, not just by science. Mal, and I want my daughter to know that her mother was brave enough to tell the truth, even when it cost everything." Another silence. Then, "I'm proud of you." The words hit her like a physical blow. 20 years of guilt, and her brother's pride felt like absolution. "Will you be okay when this all comes out?" "I've been in prison for 20 years for a crime I didn't commit. Learning that my family actively participated in putting me here. That's going to be hard. But knowing that you finally found the courage to make it right, that might be worth the pain. I'm sorry, Marcus, for all of it. I know. Go tell the truth, Mel. Set us all free." At 12:30, she stood in the parking lot of the police station, one hand on her belly where hope was kicking with unusual vigor. The building looked the same as it had that morning when she'd made her desperate confession to Officer Rodriguez. But everything else had changed. She was no longer the desperate pregnant woman who'd stumbled in with 5 words of guilt. She was someone who'd made a choice to face consequences, to prioritize truth over comfort, to give her daughter a legacy worth inheriting. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. "I'm coming to get you. Don't do anything until I get there. But it was too late for rescue, too late for negotiation. She turned off her phone and walked toward the building where her confession would finally set 20 years of truth in motion. Detective Chun was waiting for her in the lobby, as if she'd known this moment was inevitable. "Mrs. Hartwell, thank you for coming in." "Detective Chun, before we go any further, I need to tell you something. About that night in 1984, about what really happened to Miguel Rodriguez." Chun's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. The recognition of a detective who'd been waiting for this confession for weeks. "I think we should go somewhere private for this conversation," Chun said as they walked toward the interview room. Melanie felt the weight of 20 years of silence lifting from her shoulders. Soon, the truth would be out there, irreversible and complete. Soon, Marcus would be free. Miguel's family would have answers, and her daughter would inherit a family legacy based on courage rather than cowardice. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing about the aftermath would be simple or painless. But for the first time in 20 years, she was walking toward truth instead of away from it. That had to count for something. The interview room was smaller than Melanie had expected, furnished with a metal table and 2 chairs that had seen decades of confessions, denials, and desperate bargains. Detective Chun set up a recording device with the practiced efficiency of someone who documented thousands of statements. But her movements carried unusual care, as if she understood the weight of what was about to unfold. For the record, this is Detective Sarah Chun, badge number 4751, interviewing Melanie Hartwell on October 18th at 1:47 p.m. "Mrs. Hartwell, you've waived your right to have an attorney present. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And you understand that anything you say can be used as evidence in a criminal proceeding?" "I understand." Chun leaned back in her chair, her expression neutral but attentive. "You said you wanted to tell me about the night Miguel Rodriguez was killed. Take your time." Melanie placed her hands on her belly, feeling Hope's restless movements beneath her palms. Her daughter was due in 6 weeks, and there was a real possibility she wouldn't be there for the birth. But this wasn't about her anymore. This was about Miguel Rodriguez, about Marcus, about 20 years of truth that had been buried under fear and family loyalty. "My name is Melanie Carter Hartwell, and on October 15th, 1984, I killed Miguel Rodriguez." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Chen's expression didn't change, but she leaned forward slightly, her full attention focused on the woman across from her. "Tell me what happened." So Melanie told her about the eviction notice and the shut-off warnings, about Eleanor's drinking and their father's abandonment, about the desperate arithmetic of a family sliding toward homelessness. She described walking into Mike's convenience store that night with empty pockets and a heart full of fear, about Miguel's kindness when she tried to explain her family's situation. "He offered to help," she said, her voice steady despite the tears that had started falling somewhere in the middle of her account. $50 from his own wallet, and he was going to call some social cis people he knew. But I was 17, and proud and terrified, and $50 wasn't enough to save us. Chun took notes with occasional questions that helped clarify timeline and details. But mostly she listened while Melanie reconstructed that night with the precision of someone who'd relived it thousands of times. "When I reached for the register, he tried to stop me. Not violently. Miguel wasn't a violent man. He just grabbed my wrist, tried to pull me back from making a mistake. But I panicked, pulled away too hard, and he lost his balance." "What happened?" "Then, he hit his head on the corner of the counter. There was so much blood." Melanie's voice broke slightly. "I knelt beside him, tried to wake him up, but he was unconscious. I took the money, maybe $200, and ran." "Where did you go?" "Home. I was going to call an ambulance anonymously, but before I could, Marcus came looking for me. He'd sensed something was wrong, the way brothers sometimes do. When he couldn't find me at home, he went to the store. Chun's pen stopped moving, and he found Miguel Rodriguez unconscious. He found me standing over Miguel with blood on my hands and cash scattered on the floor. I was in shock, couldn't think clearly. Marcus took one look at the situation and made a choice that destroyed his life to save mine. He decided to take responsibility for your actions. He sent me home and stayed with Miguel until the ambulance arrived. When the police came, they found him there with all the evidence pointing to his guilt. He never contradicted their assumptions. The contractions were coming more frequently now, stress-induced spasms that made it difficult to sit still. Chun noticed her discomfort. Do you need medical attention? I'm fine. I need to finish this. Mrs. Hartwell, your brother has been in prison for 20 years. Why are you coming forward now? Melanie thought about the ultrasound photo in her purse, about David's voice saying he wanted to teach their daughter about honesty, about Marcus's. Letters written in the careful script of someone who'd found peace in sacrifice. Because I'm having a daughter, and I can't raise her on a foundation of lies. Because Miguel Rodriguez's family deserves to know the truth. Because my brother has paid enough for my cowardice. Chung closed her notebook and looked directly at Melanie. Is there anything else you want to add to your statement? My mother knew I was guilty from the beginning. She bribed Detective Morrison to ensure the investigation focused on Marcus and didn't look too closely at alternative theories. You're alleging police corruption in the original investigation? I'm stating facts. Morrison took money from my mother to close the case quickly and quietly. She was protecting me, but she actively participated in convicting an innocent man. Chum turned off the recording device and sat back in her chair. 28 years of police work, and she'd never heard a confession quite like this one, complete, detailed, implicating not just the confessor, but revealing corruption that had infected the original investigation. Mrs. Hartwell, you understand that you're confessing to manslaughter, possibly murder. You could be looking at significant prison time. I understand. And you're prepared to face those consequences? Melanie felt hope kick against her ribs, a strong, insistent movement that felt like encouragement. Detective Chun, I've been in prison for 20 years. It just didn't have bars. The contractions hit in earnest as Detective Chun finished processing Melanie's confession. What had been stress-induced discomfort escalated rapidly into the unmistakable rhythm of labor. 8 weeks earlier than expected. We need to get you to a hospital, Chun said, her professional composure shifting to human concern as Melanie doubled over in pain. It's too early, Melanie gasped between contractions. She's not supposed to come yet. But Hope Carter Hartwell had her own timeline. And 20 years of buried truth had apparently created the perfect conditions for premature birth. The ambulance ride to City General Hospital passed in a blur of pain and sirens, with Chun riding alongside, unwilling to let her confessor disappear into medical chaos. Before the legal process could begin, David was waiting in the emergency room, having driven there directly from his job site after receiving Chun's call. His face was pale, his work clothes dusty, his eyes holding the particular devastation of a man whose world had collapsed while he was installing kitchen cabinets. Mal, he reached for her hand as they transferred her to a wheelchair, but she pulled away. I told them everything, she said through gritted teeth as another contraction peaked. About Miguel, about Marcus, about all of it. We'll figure this out, David said, but his voice lacked conviction. How did you figure out 20 years of lies? A murdered man, a wrongfully imprisoned brother, and a wife who just confessed to manslaughter? The labor proceeded rapidly, as if Hope was eager to enter a world finally free of family secrets. Dr. Mitchell arrived within an hour, her usual cheerful demeanor tempered by the unusual circumstances of delivering a baby to a woman who might be arrested as soon as the umbilical cord was cut. Let's focus on bringing this little one safely into the world, she said, checking Melanie's progress. Everything else can wait, but everything else was already in motion. In the hallway outside the delivery room, Detective Chun was coordinating with the district attorney's office, arranging for Marcus's immediate release and Eleanor's arrest. The forensic evidence that had started the process was now supplemented by a complete confession that explained 20 years of injustice. At 11:47 p.m., Hope Carter Hartwell entered the world weighing 4 pounds, 3 ounces, her lungs strong. Despite her early arrival, she was perfect, tiny but healthy, with dark hair like her father's and her mother's stubborn chin. David cut the umbilical cord with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his daughter for the first time. "She's beautiful," he whispered, and for a moment, the weight of everything else disappeared. There was only this. New life, perfect and innocent, unmarked by the sins of previous generations. Melanie held Hope against her chest, feeling the baby's rapid heartbeat against her own. This was what courage looked like, a tiny girl who would grow up knowing that her mother had chosen truth over comfort, justice over safety. "I'm sorry," Melanie said to David, though she wasn't sure if she was apologizing for the confession, the early labor, or 20 years of lies. "I'm so sorry." David sat on the edge of the hospital bed, his finger tracing Hope's tiny hand. "I understand why you did it. I don't know if I can forgive it yet, but I understand." Detective Chun appeared in the doorway, giving them a moment of privacy before the legal machinery resumed its work. Through the window, Melanie could see news vans gathering in the hospital parking lot. Word was spreading about the confession that would free Marcus Carter and reopen a 20-year-old murder case. "Mrs. Hartwell," Chun said finally, "I need to inform you that you're under arrest for the death of Miguel Rodriguez. But given the circumstances, we'll allow you to remain here until the baby is ready to be discharged." The words should have been terrifying, but Melanie felt only relief. No more secrets, no more lies, no more watching Marcus pay for her crime. The truth was finally out, irreversible and complete. "What happens to Marcus now?" she asked. "He's being released tonight. All charges dropped. Full exoneration. He should be free within the hour." Melanie closed her eyes, feeling 20 years of guilt finally lifting from her shoulders. Marcus would be free to meet his niece, to build the life that should have been his, to stop paying for a crime he'd never committed. "And my mother?" "Melanie Carter is being arrested for obstruction of justice and bribery of a police officer. She'll be processed tonight." Hope stirred in Melanie's arms, making the small sounds that newborns make as they adjust to a world of air and light. David leaned down to kiss his daughter's forehead, his own tears falling onto her tiny face. "What kind of world have we brought her into?" he asked. Melanie looked down at her daughter, Hope, whose name had turned out to be prophetic. "A world where truth mattered more than comfort, where justice was possible even after 20 years, where a family's love could survive even the worst revelations. A better one," she said. "A much better one." Outside, the October night was giving way to dawn, and somewhere across the city, Marcus Carter was walking out of prison as a free man for the first time in 2 decades. Hope had been born into a world finally free of the lies that had defined our family for too long. It was, Melanie thought, the best possible beginning. 6 months later, Melanie sat in the visitor's room of the Women's Correctional Facility, holding Hope while they waited for David to navigate the security checkpoint. The baby had grown strong and healthy despite her early arrival, her dark eyes bright with curiosity about the world. She was slowly learning to navigate. The plea agreement had been more generous than anyone expected. Manslaughter instead of murder, with credit for cooperation and the unusual circumstances of the case. 18 months minimum security, eligible for work release after 8 months. Not the life sentence she'd feared, but enough time to pay for 20 years of silence. "She's gotten so big," David said as he settled into the plastic chair across from her, 6 months had changed him 2 new lines around his eyes, gray threading through his hair, the particular weariness of someone learning to be a single parent while processing the collapse of everything he'd believed about his marriage. "She's perfect," Melanie said, adjusting Hope's blanket. "Dr. Martinez says her development is right on schedule despite the early birth." They talked carefully about safe subjects, Hope's milestones, David's work, the logistics of visits and phone calls that comprised their relationship now. The anger had faded over the months, replaced by something more complex and harder to define. Not forgiveness, exactly, but understanding. Recognition that love could survive truth, even when truth destroyed everything else. "Marcus came by yesterday," David said. He wanted to see Hope. Melanie's breath caught. "How is he?" "Adjusting. It's hard, learning to live outside after 20 years. But he's working with a reintegration program, has a job at a nonprofit that helps ex-offenders. He talks about you sometimes." "What does he say?" David was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "He says you gave him the greatest gift anyone could give, the truth. He says knowing that someone was finally brave enough to speak up makes the 20 years feel less wasted." The words hit her like a physical blow. 20 years of Marcus's life, and he could frame her confession as a gift rather than a betrayal. That was the kind of forgiveness she didn't know how to accept. "He wants to testify at Mom's sentencing hearing," David continued, "as a character witness. He says Eleanor was protecting her child the only way she knew how." Eleanor's trial had been swift and decisive. Bribery, obstruction of justice, conspiracy, the charges that carried their own weight of shame. But Marcus's forgiveness extended even to her, recognizing the impossible position of a mother trying to save one child by sacrificing another. "What about Maria Rodriguez?" David's expression grew complicated. "She visits sometimes, brings Hope little gifts, talks about Miguel. She says," he paused, struggling with the words, "she says she's grateful to finally know the truth, even though it hurts. She says hating Marcus for 20 years was poisoning her, and now she can let that go." The visits from Maria had been unexpected, painful, and ultimately healing. Miguel's widow had come to understand Melanie not as a monster, but as a desperate child who'd made a terrible mistake. Her forgiveness felt undeserved but transformative. Proof that truth could heal wounds that lies had kept festering. "She's teaching Hope Spanish lullabies," David added with a small smile. "Says Miguel would have loved knowing his death led to new life instead of just more death." Hope stirred in Melanie's arms, making the small sounds that meant she was getting hungry. The rhythms of motherhood had adapted to the constraints of incarceration's scheduled feedings during visits, pumping breast milk that David could take. Home, measuring love in hours stolen from the demands of justice. "I have something for you," David said, reaching into his jacket. He pulled out a photograph of Marcus holding Hope for the first time, both of them in David's living room, the uncle and niece who might never have met if truth hadn't finally prevailed. "He cried," David said quietly, "when he first held her. 20 years of grief and hope and gratitude all at once. He said she was proof that something good could come from all the pain." Melanie studied the photograph through tears. Marcus looked older than his 51 years, his face marked by 2 decades of institutional life, but his expression as he looked down at Hope was pure joy. This was what redemption looked like, not the erasure of mistakes, but the transformation of pain into something that could nurture new life. "There's something else," David said. "I've been seeing a counselor, trying to work through everything that's happened. She says forgiveness isn't about forgetting or excusing what you did. It's about choosing to build a future that isn't defined by the past. And I think I'm ready to choose forgiveness. Not because what you did was right, but because our daughter deserves parents who can model how to heal from mistakes instead of being destroyed by them." The words hung between them, fragile and precious. Not a return to their old life that was impossible, but the possibility of building something new from the wreckage of truth. "I love you," Melanie said, the words carrying 20 years of gratitude and regret and hope. "I love you too. We're going to figure this out, Mel, all of us." As visiting time ended and hope was transferred back to David's arms, Melanie felt something she hadn't experienced in 20 years' peace. Not the false peace of buried secrets, but the real peace that came from consequences accepted, truth told, and love that could survive even the worst revelations. Hope would grow up knowing her family's story, the mistakes and the courage, the sacrifice and the redemption. She would understand that truth was sometimes painful, but always necessary. That love meant being brave enough to face consequences, that families could heal from even the deepest wounds. Walking back to her cell, Melanie carried the photograph of Marcus holding hope, proof that new beginnings were possible even after 20 years of endings. Her daughter would inherit a legacy of courage instead of cowardice, truth instead of lies, hope instead of despair. It was, she thought, the best possible gift she could give, not just to hope, but to the memory of Miguel Rodriguez, to Marcus's stolen years, to the possibility that justice could prevail even when it came late. The truth had set them all free, even those of them who remained behind bars.